Hello, Mike, and welcome.
Hi, Will, and I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person. So I've managed to finally get COVID, but I'm otherwise okay. Yeah.
Right. Well, look, thank you very much for taking your time this morning. So, first question I have for you is that we've known about climate change for a very long time. There's been 26 international summits to work on solutions. How are we getting on?
Okay, so I suppose the real test of how the world is getting on, since climate change is a global problem, is to have a look at the global emissions curve, and you can actually trace that curve back for about 160 years. You find it's been mathematically exponential for pretty well all of that time, going up at 1.8% per year, give or take a bit of noise between individual years. And if you zoom in on the last 30 or so years, you might expect that you'd see some evidence about the progress we've been making. What you find is that if you look at that curve, you can see a few events have happened. You can see a little dip for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. You can see a dip for the financial crisis of 2008. And you can see a slightly bigger dip for the pandemic, from which we're bouncing back now. But what you can't see, if you look at that curve, is any clear evidence that humans have noticed climate change at all. So that's a sort of depressing picture. So at the macro level, not only are we not slowing down our emissions at all, we're actually still doing more and more emissions more or less every year. So that would be the very depressing picture. But the real question, I think, would be, to what extent are we getting towards a kind of social and economic and political tipping point under which the kind of big system change that we so clearly need becomes possible? And that's much harder to gauge. But I think, what I would say is that the energy for it is rising. Humans are waking up. The sorts of conversations that I'm having with businesses are really quite different very often from how they were 2 or 3 years ago. So there's a long way to go, and there's now a huge urgency in the crisis. I mean, it looks as though we really are pushing at tipping points very hard indeed, and very possibly crossing them. So we should be feeling a lot of adrenaline. But I think I would describe it as a race between tipping points. We might be quite close to getting to that big systemic change, but on the other hand, we really do so urgently need to be close to it.
Well, thank you, Mike. And what role can businesses play to move these things forward?
So that's a really interesting question as well. So one of the good things that's been happening over the last 2 or 3 years has been everybody's talking about net zero and businesses setting targets and so on. And I think that if that's done well, that is part of what businesses can do. It's an important part. It's absolutely not the whole story. But just to talk about what it looks like for a business to have proper emissions targets. So first of all, they need to include all scopes. So that's not, especially including the whole of the supply chain. And the target needs to be, if it's going to be any kind of net zero target, it needs to be in two components. The first needs to be that the emissions themselves need to be cut in line with what the science says needs to be happening. So it needs to be 1.5 degree compatible. So that's a pretty steep cutting trajectory. And then any carbon removals on top of that might be added into to make some sort of net zero statement. I would regard that as a separate target again. And just to say about that the criteria that need to be applied to those removals need to be pretty stringent. So they need to be environmentally responsible. They need to actually be taking place. They need to be socially responsible. They need to be permanent. They need to be verifiable. So, there's a lot of stuff out there that looks good as a quote offset that actually isn't anything like as good as it sounds. So that's the carbon cutting side of it. But then what I would say to businesses is that, if we stand back and say, well, a big systemic change is required, that's about cultural change, it's about political change, it's about change about how we think about economics, it's about change about how we think about the nature of business. Then the really big question for every business to ask is, what can we do to help bring about the conditions under which that systemic change can become more possible? And that opens up a whole raft of potentially, much more, very effective actions that businesses could take. It's about their cultural engagement, it's about the extent to which their goods and services are helping to enable a low carbon and sustainability transition. It's about the sort of, it's about the culture that they're helping to set, in which we move away from so much material consumption and towards a more careful way of living on the planet. So there's tons of scope for every business. It affects everything that every business thinks, says, and does. It's a completely new agenda. Environmental stuff is not just a kind of a stick-on that you put onto business as usual. It's integral to the whole thing now.
And what do you think the role is for innovation?
And there is another huge question. So let's stand right back and have a look at the role that innovation has had for humanity over the past millennia, lots of millennia. So, every year, more or less, humans have invented a few new things, and we've partly through that innovation, we've also increased our energy supply. And these two things, this kind of technical innovation and this increase of energy supply, have gone hand in hand. And they've brought us all the good things about the society we have today, with our long life expectancies and all the rest of it. But with that, we've also been increasing our influence over the planet we're living on. And suddenly we've reached this new era that some people have a big word for and call it the Anthropocene, the age in which it's humans that are the big thing affecting the ecosystem. And suddenly that takes us into a totally new context to be operating in. So we've always been able to get away with just treating the world as a big, robust playground of a place. And every time we needed a bit more space, we could always traditionally just expand a bit. And that era has now come to an end. And so that means we need to make sure that everything about how we do life is now fit for the Anthropocene. So that it's unsurprising we need to have a bit of a rethink in some aspects of our economics, the way we do politics, the way we solve problems, the way we think about business and all the rest of it. But in particular, just in relation to innovation, we need, it's just worth reflecting that whilst innovation has brought us many good things, and whilst it's clear that there are some innovations that we absolutely need like crazy to enable us to make the low carbon transition, for example, it's also true to say that innovation taken as a whole has been part of what has taken humanity to this incredibly dangerous place. So what I would argue is we need a new relationship with technology and innovation, and we actually need to get much better at picking which ones we run with and which ones we leave on the shelf, because it has taken us to a very dangerous place. And at the moment, we're kind of stuck on a dynamic where we talk about technology as if we invent it and we're in control of it. But you could kind of argue that in a basically market-based economy, if anybody develops a technology that provides an efficiency improvement, it's very hard for anybody to not adopt it, because suddenly you get left behind if you don't. So we end up adopting all this stuff actually regardless of whether it's good for people or planet. So somehow the really huge challenge is, how can we have more agency over our technology? But interestingly, in my business, we're starting to work with some high-tech research and development outfits now that are asking that question in a very searching way. And they understand, for example, that efficiency improvements don't by default lead to a lower carbon world. Actually, they lead to just more growth and a higher carbon world. So there's something else about innovation that we need to be looking for if we actually want it to be contributing to sustainability. It's a very interesting area to look at, and I hope you're going to be exploring it a bit. I think you are going to be exploring a bit over the next few hours.
Oh, brilliant. Well, look, thank you so much, Mike, for your time.